In one of my recent videos, I talked about how when linguists hear what many people think of as language mistakes, they're more interested in the underlying patterns behind them rather than focusing on calling people out for speaking badly. But does that mean there's no such thing as a language mistake whatsoever? Well, I think we'd all agree that regardless of what dialect you speak, we all have occasional slips of the tongue.
Nobody's perfect, right?
Did you just have a stroke, Pam? It's nobody's perfect.
And you probably have that aunt or uncle who's like particularly bad at speaking. A couple of months back, a friend of mine introduced me to a certain pop culture figure who's known for very particular pronunciations and vocabulary. And I think she can serve as a great example of the kinds of language mistakes that we hear on a daily basis. And what's even more interesting is that those mistakes can give us a window into the ways that language really works. But first, there are lots of kinds of language mistakes. So what exactly are we talking about here in this video? What we're talking about specifically are known as speech production errors. Basically, it's anytime your speech system produces something that wasn't exactly what your brain intended. And while we can definitely agree that speech errors are mistakes, what we're going to see today is that often they're far from random. So let's get started with our first example.
I might skydive after this. Like, yo, if I could survive Love Island, I could survive.
Sure.
Die skiving.
This kind of error is known as a spoonerism, named after William Archibald Spooner, who was a clergyman who was apparently known for making this kind of mistake.
It is customary to cuss the bride.
Hissed all my mystery lectures.
We should take a moment to mention that probably a lot of the quotes that are attributed to him are things he never actually said. And he actually seemed to be pretty self-conscious and resentful about the whole thing. Apparently, one time a group of students came to him and asked him to give a speech, and he responded saying, "You don't really want a speech. You just want to hear me say one of those things," which is pretty depressing when you think about it. And just think about how disrespectful it is that to this day, we continue to refer to this type of mistake using his name. Anyway, spoonerisms can actually reveal some interesting things about the processes that lead to word formation. So you may know that linguists categorize sounds into different categories, such as consonants and vowels. And while the average person will probably struggle to give a definition of what a consonant is and what a vowel is, your brain clearly knows the difference. Because when we produce these spoonerisms, consonants only switch with consonants and vowels only switch with vowels.
Did you grab anything when you walked out the door?
Grab nothing but two Tortino's pizza out of the refrigerator and my doggy.
A slight chance of some participation. It's rain. It's going to bring a possibility of some rain.
You can get there right now by scanning this QR code on your smartphone.
It's going to be areas of drist and mizzle. Drist and, what am I saying here? Mist and drizzle. I literally combined both.
These aren't just categories that linguists made up that exist in textbooks. These categories are actual real categories that your brain uses to organize the sounds that your mouth can produce. And similarly, when we swap words in a sentence, we only swap words in like categories. In other words, words that have the same parts of speech. So nouns tend to swap with nouns and verbs tend to swap with verbs.
Can you demonstrate for us what it's like to brush our teeth, Pet, just a little bit?
Certainly.
Advice from a local sheriff on how to talk to your drugs about kids.
For $64, a professional instructor will take you for a 3-hour heart-pounding lap ride.
So once again, this is a super interesting insight into the fact that in our brains, these categories are real concrete things that it uses to construct grammar and sentences as we go along. Another similar type of error doesn't involve the swapping or substituting of one syllable for another, but rather mixing up specific features of sounds. Let me explain. To go back to Amaya, one of the most frequent errors that I noticed her getting roasted for online is her tendency to replace the T in words like opportunity with an L, producing something like opportunily.
I felt like this was my opportunity.
And first of all, reading the comments, one of the things that I noticed a lot is people calling that a lisp, which just no, that's not what a lisp is at all. I'll add that a lot of the things that people called out as sounding like L's kind of just sounded like regular T's between vowels in American English.
Heart rate is being tachycardic right now. Your girl is trying to flip that anxiety.
But some of them definitely did sound like L's, even to me. But the same reason that those two sounds can be mistaken for each other when hearing them is why they might get mixed up when producing them. The English tap T sound and the English L sound are actually pretty acoustically similar, and they share a place of articulation. Not to mention the fact that as a Dominicana from Nueva York, even though English seems to be her first language, we can't rule out some interference from Spanish, which notoriously has weakened consonants, especially between vowels. And another factor that may contribute to this mixing up of those two sounds is the fact that itty and illy are both productive suffixes in English. And if her brain really is just mixing up or conflating those two different affixes, well, that wouldn't be the first time that's happened in English. But that's a story for another day. Okay, we're going to talk about it. All right, so if you're some kind of nerd, you might be familiar with terms like gerund or present participle. They're basically the verb forms in English that end with ing. So like running, eating, being, those can all be gerunds or present participles. So if that's the case, what's the difference between the two? So when these words are used as nouns, grammarians have historically considered them to be gerunds. But when they have some other function, such as serving as adjectives or being part of a verb conjugation, they were considered present participles. But according to the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language, a distinction between the two can no longer be sustained. So in other words, modern grammarians are increasingly recognizing that the distinction between gerunds and present participles is basically a distinction without a difference. What's interesting though is that even though those two forms are identical now, they actually originally come from two completely different English endings. But gradually, in the transition from Old English into Modern English, weakening of those endings and essentially speakers getting the two endings confused with one another has led to them merging into one. So just to be clear, opportunily is not a real word. She made a mistake. But it goes to show that the difference between a fake word and a real word, a grammar mistake and a regional variation, basically comes down to time and the amount of speakers who have it.
I'm also feeling a huge weight of gratitually.
At first, I was scratching my head a little bit, trying to figure out exactly how this mistake ended up happening. But essentially, I think it comes down to being a blending of the words gratuity and gratitude. And then when producing this new word, gratituity, her brain applies that characteristic lateralized T, making it
Gratitually.
So just to be clear, gratitually, not a real word. She made a mistake. But that mix-up does lead us to an interesting question that you probably haven't ever thought about. How are words organized in our brains? Like, you might imagine that you have this dictionary in your head that's just a list of all the words you know in like alphabetical order. And that would make sense because if I ask you to come up with 3 words that start with C, you can probably think of cookie and cake and carbon. But what if I ask you to come up with a word that rhymes with cat? Well, maybe you would say bat or mat or hat or sat. Okay, what if I asked you to come up with a synonym for happy? You might say content or joyful. What if I said a word that means the opposite? You might say angry or sad or upset. The fact that you can call to mind these different words based on different criteria would indicate that rather than being organized in your brain in one way, like the books in the library according to the Dewey Decimal System or names in a list that are in alphabetical order, your brain has this complex web of associations based on the sounds and the meanings of words. And these blendings can give us a peek into that process. According to one research paper on the topic, a speaker has in mind some meaning which he wishes to convey. Where there are a number of alternative possibilities, rather than making an immediate selection, he brings them both into a buffer storage compartment. Either a selection occurs at that point, or the words are blended, resulting in the above kind of errors. So if we take this specific example, gratitude and gratuity seem to be occupying a similar space in her mental web. And that makes sense because they both have the same first syllable and they both have vague positive associations. And going even further, you give gratuity when you're feeling gratitude. And if someone receives gratuity, they might feel gratitude for that. So as her brain was forming that sentence, it seems that both of those words got pulled up into the same transmitter pod, so to speak, and got all Cronenberg together. But thinking about that process of words being called to mind from this like mysterious web of vocabulary is crazy because think about the last time something was on the tip of your tongue and you were trying to come up with exactly what it was. Your brain was searching through an amazingly complex web of connections based on things that sounded similar, things that maybe had a similar beginning, similar ending, or just were associated with the word you're looking for in some way. And take a second to think about freestyle rappers. They can string together complex, crisply articulated, multisyllabic rhymes while also including wordplay and puns.
Freestyle? Well, let me sit back. Go ahead, Marshall.
Okay. Years ago, they tried to put me in the. This is live.
Did you want to try to read something from your book?
Yeah.
Think about how much they're working that vocabulary network in their brain to form their sentences. So the next time you stumble over a word or don't pronounce something exactly how you wanted to, give yourself a break. Think about the complex tightrope that you're walking on. And if you manage to get something out that makes sense, hey, pat yourself on the back. And let's give our particularly articulatorily challenged friends like Amaya a little bit of a break and appreciate them for the treasure trove of linguistic insights that they accidentally provide us. All right, I've been Daniel. Thanks for watching. Bye. And let's give our especially articulatory and let's give our particularly articulatorily her brain applied that trademark lateral her brain applied that